So part of what I would like to do with this channel is review some films, obviously in the realm of horror, but also just paranormal in general. There are a lot of horror films that aren't paranormal. So sticking within that range, although I will say that Shin Godzilla, at least at the start, is probably one of the creepiest movies visually that I've seen in a while. And that includes straight up horror films. This is a creepy movie, but it's creepy in a really good way. And this movie was a surprise to me because I didn't even hear it was coming out. I just saw that it was playing near me and I went to go see it. And I was not pleasantly surprised because the reviews were good, but I was actually surprised at how poignant a Godzilla movie could be while still being freaking terrifying. Basically, the last Godzilla movie I saw was the one I think was released in 1999 or 2000. I didn't see the more recent American one. But that one, the first American Godzilla, was such a horrible movie that it pretty much destroyed the idea of Godzilla, as well as Matthew Broderick's career, I would think. Shin Godzilla, or it's also called Godzilla Resurgance, but I'm going to call it Shin Godzilla because that's, for the sake of this review anyway. It doesn't really matter, but that's what it's called in Japanese, I guess. It's basically the real Godzilla that everybody knows and supposedly loves. I mean, obviously, basically on the way I talk about this, I haven't seen the original Toho Godzilla, which was the one with the cheap effects. I mean, I've seen it, but I never actually sat down and watched it and got engaged because I can't get engaged with. There's nothing to those movies, really. I mean, it's kind of just, it's all there for just practical visual effect, and that's fine, but it's just not something I get into. But this one was a lot different. This one was not just that. In fact, this movie is so far removed from that sort of Godzilla film that it's actually kind of surprising at times because it's played up more like a political drama. But not a political drama where the characters are evil. A political drama where everyone participates together for the common goal, which is a very good-natured movie, which is surprising and almost optimistic. But I see why they went that route when you watch the whole thing, because the movie basically starts with a creature, and you don't even know if it's Godzilla, because it doesn't even look like Godzilla. It's basically like this half-formed creature, and it's based off of, I think, a real prehistoric fish that was found in Japan. There was an actual fish that looks like this, and that fish was freaking creepy. When I saw that fish in real life, it's a real life fish. It's from I think the Precambrian era, or it's like a really ancient fish, but somehow it survived because that's just how natural selection works. Some things just survive for a really long time, and so when you see it, it's just the creepiest thing in the world. And that's basically what the creature in this movie is. It's an what it starts as anyway. It's basically a big amphibious sort of reptile with these bug eyes. They don't move at all. It's got these open gills that shoot blood because you find out that it's basically like a thermal nuclear reactor. So it's basically shooting out blood, and it goes on to land to cool itself off, which in and of itself is a cool idea because Godzilla is not really the villain in this movie. The thing is freaking terrifying looking. It's definitely the scariest Godzilla design. Period. Even when it's fully formed, it's pretty horrific, and it's an ugly monster, but it's almost sympathetic because it's not really doing anything other than what it's designed to do. So basically, after a little bit of sort of dialogue, you find out that the monster was created out of a thermal nuclear reactor, and that's interesting. It's interesting to know that that's where the plot line is going because it's obvious that Godzilla came around after World War II and is basically a metaphor for nuclear power. Which you would, if you told that to a Godzilla fan, they'd probably be like, no, but you have to ask, what other force could destroy cities prior to World War II? It would be the atomic bomb. So Godzilla is basically a metaphor for nuclear energy. And this also goes hand in hand with the Fukushima reactor. In fact, I'm surprised that the Fukushima reactor, which, for those who don't know, the Fukushima reactor is a reactor in Japan that I guess it overloaded or something. There was an accident, and there's just spilling nuclear waste out into the ground. And I don't know why they didn't just use that as a plot point, because that would have been an interesting plot point. Instead, they use it that it's basically nuclear dumping. They're dumping nuclear waste into the water, the Japanese, and it's created this monster. And there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in this movie, because the Japanese have to turn to America, because, you know, that's how the UN works. America controls everything. So they have to turn to the UN has to turn to America to get help to use nukes to destroy Godzilla, who is basically a living nuclear reactor. And that in itself is really interesting, and I think it makes the movie really interesting, because I had to audibly laugh at one point when the Japanese were kind of getting excited that they could contact the American military and get access to their nuclear supply to stop a nuclear monster. And it's basically, there's even a line in here about how nukes are a deterrent. I mean, it'd be interesting if Donald Trump watched this movie, actually, because it would teach him a little bit about why nukes exist. Because nukes exist as a deterrent, and that's the idea here, is that the Americans are going to use nukes against Godzilla, along with the Japanese military. They're all united to stop Godzilla. So Godzilla is basically just a metaphor for humanity versus a threat, and the nukes are kind of just sort of the object. They're just the object being used there. But because it's nuclear energy, it's almost like a metaphor for environmentalism. And as an action film, it works really well, but there's only really 3 action scenes, and probably all the action in this movie is probably limited to about like 20 minutes. The rest is just a lot of really fast-paced characters coming in and out. And what's interesting is the characters don't really have a form or function. They just sort of show up, and they zip in and out, and some of them die off screen, and you don't find out till later. So by the end of the movie, there are basically like 2 or 3 main characters, but they're basically kind of chiseled out of this. They kind of come out of the script automatically because they're the only ones left to actually take up that role, which is interesting because you recognize these familiar faces, and it's kind of like, oh, well, there's that guy, and that guy, you know, oh, he's still alive, so now he's taking the reins. So it's kind of just, there are plenty of characters who have only one scene, and basically they form a group set to James Bond style music that's going to take this thing down about 1/3 of the way through when they figure out what the hell it is. And they come up with all this scientific jargon, which is basically pseudoscience, because the thing can evidently hyper-evolve, because even though they know all of the science behind evolution in general, they somehow still manage to make it so that the thing can just super-evolve like a Pokemon in 5 minutes, which doesn't really bother me that much, because you know coming into this that it's not going to be realistic, and yet it's as realistic as can be. And I would say this is probably the best Godzilla movie that could be made. And when I say that, that's because given the limitations of the character, I mean, the score is excellent, the music is very good, it's a very eclectic soundtrack. There's one scene in particular where they're finally trying to take it down. They don't succeed at taking it down, but they do it to an extent, and it sort of unleashes this nuclear blast from its mouth, which I believe was from the original Toho films. You know, that shoots that laser out of its mouth. And when it does that, it's set to this really powerful Japanese orchestral music, and it's a really powerful scene. And it makes it kind of a tragedy, because Godzilla is kind of this sympathetic creature. It's not really evil, it's just an animal. So it's kind of like there's even a scene where there's protesters outside of the whatever the main political building is. I don't know what they call it in the movie, but they're outside. They're protesting to the government that protect Godzilla, because I guess because either it's almost like an environmental religious figure to the people, and it's because it's called Godzilla, I guess. And it's kind of ironic, because it's kind of just it's sort of like a tongue-in-cheek irony regarding, you know, the way people want to protect the environment, and yet the environment can create very ugly things. In this case, you know, it's super evolved because of nuclear radiation, but I mean, it's the same principle. So it's really interesting sort of counterpoint. And, yeah, the score is good. The writing is really good. The whole nuclear subtext, especially the way it ends, because the way it ends is basically I'm not going to spoil the ending itself, but the way the last act occurs, it's a unilateral agreement between Japan and the United States to take the creature down. And it's kind of, it's very one-sided unilateral because that's kind of how the UN operates. It's like, if you agree to work with the U.S., then the U.S. is in charge. And that's the idea here, is that, you know, they're putting the United States in charge. So it's a very political movie, but when it comes down to just the effects and the visuals, it's a very colorful film. The visuals are excellent all around. Some of the CG at the beginning is actually kind of bad, and I think it might have just been budget constraints, because the first time Godzilla shows up on land, it looks pretty bad, and I'm thinking maybe they just didn't get to finish the CG on that, because when Godzilla's actually fully grown up, it's pretty freaking, it's about as good as CG can look. So I don't really fault the film for that. I think it was probably just either they had to rush it out or they had budget constraints, because I can tell that this is a very competently made movie. And there are a lot of practical effects. I mean, there's buildings being destroyed and cars being crushed. There's a point where buildings fall over and you see, like, furniture sliding down. And they didn't have to do that, because in a lot of American movies today, they don't do that. If a building is falling, it'll all be CG. But you can tell those are real pieces of furniture that are falling down. Or if they're not real, they look as real reality looks, which would be ideally how CG should look, but doesn't. So, really, the movie has a really hyper-realistic look, which... I mean, for something that, you know, cartoony as an idea, for it to look that realistic, I think is excellent. So overall, aside from a few bad CG moments, and there's a couple jokes that made me a little cringe, because there's a character who is, she's an American politician, and she's a woman, and she's going to run for president, and it's just like, okay, I get it. It's a little tongue-in-cheek. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor. But there I thought, and the fact that they reference it twice, I thought it went a little far. Like, I get it, okay? I get the joke, but the joke's not funny. It's just a reference, so it's kind of just like, okay, whatever. But other than that, this is a really good, really deep movie, and really interesting, and it provokes a lot of sociological discussion if you actually talk about it. Because there's a lot of interesting things about it. And it really elaborates on the overall idea of why Godzilla exists, or why Japan is so weird, because there actually have been art exhibits about Japan, and the reason that a lot of this weird culture like anime, anime and what else? I guess just that whole, you know, Godzilla, just that whole cartoony image, part of it is taking out of that, you know, that westernized Disney sort of look, but there's a darkness to Japanese stuff that it really stems out of the aftermath of the atomic bomb. And I think that for, how do I phrase this? I think that for Godzilla, as an almost direct metaphor for nuclear damage in this film, I think it works absolutely perfectly. I think that the directors really nailed it. And pretty much everything about the movie it's got a lot of like little dry humor laughs, and I think it's just really well done. So definitely go see it. Hopefully I didn't spoil it too much, but yeah, it's awesome.